So we have the whole issue of the new accuser, the new accuser from, I think it was like 1981 or 1979, concerning the Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. Now I want to remind you guys, I was not crazy about Kavanaugh. When he was nominated, first of all, I wanted that other one, the woman, whatever, Coney Barrett. And in retrospect, this probably wouldn't even be an issue if she would have been nominated. Of course, Kavanaugh is qualified if you just talk about professional credentials. I just, a lot of the architecture of the Patriot Act came from Kavanaugh, among other people. And for me, that's not really something that I really agree with. So I said, I'd be fine if this guy didn't get on the Supreme Court. But that was before all of the freakouts that have just been happening over and over again about his nomination. So that's at this point, I'd be fine with him either serving or not serving on the Supreme Court, because I just don't think that people are really reacting to the Supreme Court in a mature way. Most of us in the United States, we don't have law degrees, and even those people that do often are, way under, they're punching way above their weight when they're trying to deal with issues of the Supreme Court. I know a handful of lawyers here, and often the answers I get to them when I ask them, first of all, they really act bent out of shape when you ask them any legal question, most of them. But then when it concerns the Supreme Court, many of them say the Supreme Court is not really relevant to the day-to-day practice of law in the United States. And people thinking that a Supreme Court nominee will dramatically alter our existence in the United States, they don't really understand what that means, even if it was true. Okay, yes, there were a number of landmark decisions like Brown versus Board that they did transform the landscape of our country. And of course, there were other decisions that, have kind of slipped through the cracks and people don't really analyze. And I think the reality is most of us don't care who's on the Supreme Court. There was a poll taken not long ago where I think it was like 53% of people said they couldn't identify a single justice. I do know that I think a couple years ago I couldn't remember the current ones. So now I know that there's Roberts, Sotomayor, Kagan, Breyer, Thomas, Ginsburg, of course, and then there's Gorsuch, and who cares? For one thing, people behave as if these are, pinnacles of our society, but in reality, a lot of them, if you observe, I heard that Justice Thomas spent over 20 years not actually speaking during the Supreme Court session. Now, some of you might think, oh, that's him wasting the public's time. But if he's not speaking, he still writes opinions on cases. But these are not personalities that they get on the Supreme Court because they're good for mugging for the camera or jumping into the stands at Lambeau Field or whatever. They just have to be able to apprehend what's going on when a case comes to them. In many cases, they get it wrong in the eyes of the public or in the eyes of a certain sector of the public, and they're fallible people. But now that you inject the issue of the Me Too movement here, it kind of illustrates how far our country has fallen when we really start to, I start to ask, do people not understand what the American system of justice is about? Forget about the Supreme Court for a second. Every American citizen, even the guilty, has the right to a fair defense and also, I guess, a speedy trial. They have a right to an attorney. Of course, there's the Miranda rights, which were won by the Supreme Court through the Miranda decision. I think it was in the late 50s. I believe the Miranda decision was handed down, and the Miranda decision was handed down in a case where the suspect was guilty, or at least the facts of the case show that it was a guilty individual. I forgot I think his name was Richard Miranda. I could be wrong. Who I think was well, let's look it up. The Miranda decision while we're at it. So it was Miranda versus Arizona, and the plaintiff was Ernesto Arturo Miranda, who was a Mexican American born here in the U.S. And he did, says here, he was a laborer whose conviction on kidnapping, rape, and armed robbery charges based on his confession and a police interrogation was set aside in the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case Miranda versus Arizona, which ruled that criminal suspects must be informed of their right against self-incrimination and their right to consult with an attorney before being questioned by police. This warning is known as a Miranda warning. Now, we all see nowadays in every cop show, you have these police reading people their Miranda rights, and it's taken to be kind of this way that oh, you're showing the criminal up. No, in reality, you have to let somebody know their rights in order for there to be a fair prosecution. Otherwise, it really starts to, I guess it was in 1966. Otherwise, you do have an issue of whether they receive a fair trial, and this is something that I believe that it's not unique to the U.S. It's just in America we call it the Miranda rights. Now, this is a person who was accused of kidnapping and raping an 18-year-old woman. And then let's see what happened to him after that. The Supreme Court set aside Miranda's conviction, which was tainted by the use of the confession that had been obtained through improper interrogation. The state of Arizona retried him. At the second trial, his confession was not introduced into evidence, but he was convicted again based on testimony given by his estranged common-law wife. So apparently he might have been guilty. He was sentenced to 20 to 30 years in prison. Miranda was paroled in 1972. After his release, he started selling autographed Miranda warning cards for $1.50. That's pretty original. Over the next few years, Miranda was arrested numerous times for minor driving offenses and eventually lost the privilege of driving a car. He was arrested for the possession of a gun, but the charges were dropped. However, because this violated his parole, he was sent back. This guy just seems to have no luck. On January 31st, 1976, after his release for violating his parole, a violent fight broke out in a bar in Phoenix. Miranda received a lethal wound from a knife, and he was pronounced dead. So this guy, trouble just seemed to find him. And the life of Ernesto Miranda, whether you believe he was guilty or not, is an illustration of why we need the presumption of innocence in the United States. And probably for any other country that wants a system where you're not just throwing people into prison arbitrarily because you feel that they're guilty, or that the court feels that they're guilty, or the community feels that they're guilty. Society feels a person is guilty. Sometimes it makes sense, and we all see trials that make us want somebody to be put behind bars. Of course, there was a recent Molly Tibbetts murder that set a lot of people off. I didn't really comment on it. I was a little busy with other stuff at the time. But I do remember tweeting out when they were looking for her, the description, of course. It was, I think it was considered an Amber Alert at the time. So, unfortunately, with the Kavanaugh accusation, you get this situation again, where a person is coming forward, giving a story that cannot be independently validated. It's all about who has the more witnesses and who's able to substantiate what, and blah, 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 and is this person credible or not? And I've been trying to be consistent, and I hope that you've seen that. Those of you that have watched this channel or have we've had live streams together. Some other YouTubers might see this, and I try to be consistent with this and say, even people that we disagree with, and beyond that, people that we find despicable in other matters, deserve the presumption of innocence, whether they are on our side or on somebody else's side. It was the same thing last year. I was not crazy about this Roy Moore character running for Senate. The fact of the matter is, despite his pinheaded relationship to speaking on camera and speaking to anybody, there's never been any evidence presented that Roy Moore harassed or raped or conducted himself in any way that would have been considered criminal when he was in Alabama and a young prosecutor. Now, there are people who say that he did, but they can't prove it now. And now that the Senate race is over, nobody cares about that anymore. It's very bizarre. The whole point of that whole case was that they wanted Roy Moore not to serve in the Senate. And what did they gain out of it? They have a senator who is kind of a lukewarm corporate Democrat, and instead of a hardcore, staunch conservative Republican. So, I mean, if you want to call that a gain, that if you're a liberal, for example, you can call that a gain, but it's not justice. A person who you don't know was accused of something that nobody can prove. And that's really the issue here. Okay, we all have things that we have in our past that we're not proud of. Certain things that we're not proud of could be violations of the law. I mean, especially people that have, they've used drugs, or they've driven under the influence of drugs, or alcohol, of course, which is a drug. There's a lot of people that get away with driving under the influence because they happen to, the stars align and they're able to get to their destination without being pulled over. So how are you supposed to really scrutinize somebody's every move? Well, with Kavanaugh, now they're trying to say, have we learned anything since Anita Hill? And when I started reading the article, I thought, maybe this woman would say the Anita Hill decision was concerned Clarence Thomas was really overblown innuendo. But no, this person said it's 1991 again in America. Has anything really changed? 27 years ago, Oklahoma law professor Anita Hill reluctantly stepped into an unforgiving public spotlight to accuse U.S. Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment. He was confirmed anyway. This time, California psychology professor Christine Blasey Ford has come forward reluctantly to accuse U.S. Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault. Her act of courage raises so many questions. Will Republicans in the Senate do the right thing and postpone their vote on this man who has had credibility problems through the entire hearing process? I don't know what credibility problems they're talking about, because from my perception, Kavanaugh's just simply said exactly what he needs to do, what he needs to say in order to prevent people from seeing any sort of bias, which is if you're trying to be confirmed for the Supreme Court, that's what you do. And in fact, he was using the Ginsburg tactic, saying that you can't prejudge verdicts without knowing the actual particulars of the specifics of what happened. And I remember listening to both her response and his response, and they were virtually the same. Because, for one thing, he cited her response from the 90s hearing when she was nominated by Bill Clinton. Have we learned nothing from the tribulations and aftermath of the Thomas / Hill debacle, when then Judiciary Committee Chairman Joe Biden refused to allow 3 other women to corroborate Hill's allegations under oath, and has since apologized for his terrible judgment? Well, we'll get to Joe Biden in a second. Has the Me Too movement not proved that women hold on to painful secrets of sexual harassment and assault for years and years and years because they know they will be disbelieved, mocked, humiliated, and or denied work if they step forward to accuse powerful men? So then what they're trying to do here, what this lady is trying to do, Robin Abkarian, is to make this an issue of, well, it's really a problem for women to come forward and accuse men because of all the traumatic scrutiny that will occur. So in response to that, I will say this: it does not matter how hard it is for you to come forward. The discomfort that you feel does not trump somebody's constitutional right to defend their innocence. Okay? It does not. Again, it is the burden of proof is on the accuser. It's not on the defendant. That's the way it's always been in the American system of justice. And so, as far as I'm concerned, I don't see why that should change. And does anyone really? So I'm continuing to read. And does anyone really find it hard to believe that the culture of male privilege responsible for producing the perversions of men as varied as President Trump, Matt Lauer, Charlie Rose, Garrison Kaler, Leslie Moonves, Al Franken, Louis C.K., Bill O'Reilly, Roger Ailes, Brett Ratner, Russell Simmons could also produce a drunken prep school senior who assaulted a 15-year-old girl at a party? So I want to say this, okay? If you're 17 years old, first of all, if you were a minor, and I believe this says in 1982. First of all, this person was a minor. This was, of course, in the 80s when sexual mores were definitely different at the time too. There's also no substantiation of this right now, and that this is really some issue where, tough luck, okay? You held this, in your own memory since 1982, and there's no way to actually prove what happened. Now, of course, there are issues where there's a critical mass of people in certain cases, such as the Bill Cosby case, which for some reason she didn't. That Bill Cosby case was a much more much more extreme case than, let's say, Louis C.K. This is really the issue here. How do you validate the story of somebody who is now 51 years old, so 36 years have passed since the alleged incident? Initially, you didn't want to come forward because you said, oh, I want to protect my anonymity. Okay, well, the person you're accusing can't protect their anonymity, so that's not in the spirit of our system of justice. We don't care if you think that this is very painful for you, because the idea of a fair system of justice is that victims are able to get accountability from the perpetrator, and perpetrators or alleged perpetrators, defendants, are able to face their accuser. Otherwise, there's no balance. There's no balance to the scales of justice. There's a reason that the metaphor is a scale of justice. Okay? Because if you don't have balance on either side, and this is an ancient metaphor. Okay, I'm kind of being a bit demagogic right now, but you cannot have an advantage to one side where they say, well, we can accuse whoever you are. And this is something that people have understood from many different new types of prosecution, where, of course, there are confidential informants and things like that. Well, okay, you can have your confidential informants, but if you have confidential informants that and exclusively and they appear to be that it's complicated, numerous trials of organized crime figures. I just read a book about what's his name? I think his name was Dominic Casso. Anthony Casso. I'll type him in here. Who was the Lucchese crime family underboss, and he's still in prison today. And he turned informant on the entire mafia eventually, but because the prosecutors, because the FBI and the Department of Justice had already put so much stock into the testimony of a different mafia informant, what's his name? Sammy the Bull Gravano, who's very famous for fingering John Gotti. Because all of the trust of the public and the prosecution was in Sammy the Bull Gravano, Casso's testimony had to be covered up, and he basically, they screwed him over and basically put him in prison up until today. And I think he's still in Supermax prison in Colorado. That guy's never gonna come out of there. They're gonna bury him under the prison, basically. I'm exaggerating a bit, but you understand what I'm saying. The issue that I'm talking about is that every defendant in the United States, on paper, has the right to a fair trial. And unfortunately, we're not talking about a fair trial here. We're talking about a trial by media, a trial by scorn, a trial by moral judgment, by people that really they have a personal interest in the accuser going down. And that's exactly what, at the beginning of this video, I said our system of justice is not about. Notice the people that are put in here in this group. Now, some of them, yes, they are kind of liberal figures. Certainly Garrison Keillor and Al Franken, Louis C.K. to some degree. Bill O'Reilly was not, and Roger Ailes is absolutely not. But the fact of the matter is that those people that she mentions were all spent shell casings. Even Russell Simmons, with all due respect, his career was on a decline anyway, and she doesn't address really the fact that Biden himself, who she talked about earlier, is a creeper.
All right, come on, slide in here.
Thank you. Maggie, do you want to come over here?
Let's come over here. Come on, Maggie, make me look better, okay?
Oh,
There we go.
All right, everybody look right here. Do you guys mind moving this way? There we go. Right there. Thank you.
You gotta look up at the center photographer up top of it. Right up here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, well, nice to see you guys.
Thank you.
See you back home, I hope.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay? Hi. Hey, Corey, good to see you.
Our daughter Allison, or son Thatcher.
How old are you?
11 years old, hoping to come Dad.
Hey, handsome. How do you? How you doing?
He's laughing.
You're so lucky. Congratulations. Well, you want your daughter to hold the Bible? You jump in the middle, Angel. You come right on this side of Mommy.
Come here.
No, you come over here. That's it. Keep going. You're standing right next to me. There you go. And then we're going to have...
Yeah, that's creepy shit there. That is fucking unbelievable. And yet people don't give a fuck about that. If you're from the LA Times, you really don't give a shit, because George Biden is probably going to be the person you're going to be writing op-eds for in about a year, saying that he's like the real deal and the answer to Trump. And by the way, he called all Trump supporters the dregs of society today. Yeah, you're really... I mean, you were the vice president of the entire country. Maybe if you weren't such a dumbass and had actual ideas, people wouldn't react to you the way that they do, because Joe Biden's accomplished very little in his career, except for being basically a guy who spends a lot of money and gets the country into debt as a senator and as a vice president. The other double standard here that people are forgetting is that you're talking about the senators who are going to vote on Kavanaugh's hearing. And for them to suddenly grandstand and say, well, we can't have this type of person on the Supreme Court. Well, you have people of much worse moral character in the U.S. Senate. Remember, he did have John McCain there for fucking forever. And who else? They had tons of people in the House that were basically serial gropers. And you had Al Franken. And you had Joe Biden. And you had, what was the other guy? I think Chris Dodd and Ted Kennedy were notorious. They were like always banging chicks and kind of like feeling them up and shit like that. That is the U.S. Senate. The U.S. Senate probably has more sexual predators on average than any other social circle aside from like a prison or certain neighborhoods where lots of ex-cons live. So and of course I would say that the way that the U.S. Senate behaves kind of illustrates why our country is as shitty as it is today in terms of the unity and in terms of the actual standards of ethics. Okay, it's why you have people like me who are not exactly we're not here to basically preach to people to be to live as if you're an image of the Lord or something, although obviously that's a good thing if you can. But we're saying this: these people we're not sending our best to the U.S. Senate. It's just a fact. You have Bob Menendez, who apparently, according to testimony in his corruption trial from last year, this is a senator from New Jersey, America's dump. This guy was accused of I believe, sleeping with underage prostitutes in the Dominican Republic. Let's see here. So in 2015, the defense moved to throw out the entire prosecution on the grounds that those allegations were false. But the U.S. attorney argued in a filing the government had specific and corroborated allegations that defendants Menendez and Melgen had sex with underage prostitutes in the Dominican Republic. Okay, so what the hell? So this was, for years, this was going on with this shady doctor who did go to prison and who was a buddy of Bob Menendez, and they were in the thick of it together. And all of this bullshit, nothing happens to Menendez. He's still running for Senate in New Jersey for re-election this year, which if he wins, it would be totally logical because that's what represents the shittiest state in the country, New Jersey. And if there's any viewers out there from New Jersey who watch my channel, if you want something to change, leave New Jersey. Okay, that's my best advice to you. But this is not so. To get serious again, I don't think that anything that comes out of this will be good for maintaining the reputation of the Supreme Court or of the U.S. Senate, because it has become totally politicized. The Keith Ellison accusation from a couple weeks ago, which is for spousal abuse, or I guess, yeah, technically spousal abuse because it's a girlfriend, girlfriend, spouse, partner abuse. This woman accused Keith Ellison. I said at the time, look, lady, I don't like, and obviously she's not listening to me, but I don't like Keith Ellison in the least. I think he's a piece of crap. I think he's a serial, he's what do you call it, a pathological liar, has lied about his entire career, has pretended that he's not an associate of the Nation of Islam. But I said at the time that he deserves to be given the benefit of the doubt unless they can present evidence that he's guilty. And I stand by that. So, yes, I think this Me Too thing, it's gotten so out of control that eventually people are going, the standards will create two different Americas. The America that believes in the presumption of innocence and the America that's trying to find the next person to hang on the tree. That's about it, and I'll talk to you guys later. Please like, subscribe, share, and comment when it uploads.